Well, lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it. And sort of welcome to The Truth Trade, which is a podcast that deals with influence in all its forms, and especially sort of strategic communications, political strategic communications.
Thank you. Just a second. Just a second. We're recording, yes? Yeah. It's just because so not to have any technical difficulties on our side. Okay, yeah.
No problem at all. Well, looking at your amazing CV, I think probably the best thing almost is you introduce yourself so people know who you are when they're listening to this. So how would you describe yourself, Julia?
Well, first and foremost, I would describe myself as a writer. And strange as it is right now, I would also describe myself as somebody who is reverting to his old trade of the historian. Because I started as a historian, I started as a philologist, and right now I'm doing a lot of work on actually the origins of Christianity, because Putin's regime is just not sufficiently interesting to write about. But I'm also well known, and actually I think all my troubles are starting because of my journalist work. I started to become a journalist after I became a writer, and even a well-known writer. Precisely because I was publishing fantasy novels, and then I realized that it was back in the 90s. A lot of interesting things are happening in our country, in Russia. It's an extremely interesting society. It was an extremely interesting society, I would say. Something like the epoch of robber barons back in United States at the beginning of the century, and in the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20s. So. I started doing a lot of journalism. Obviously, I was not that concerned about what I'm saying, because I say journalism was for me a means to an end. And of course, this led me gradually in opposition to Mr. Putin. And this gradually led to all the problems, because right now I have to live in exile. I continue to write for Russian newspapers, actually for the biggest Russian opposition newspaper, Novaya Gazeta. That's the newspaper has the unfortunate distinction of having 5 journalists killed in line of duty. And I'm continuing to have a weekly radio program for the radio, which is called Echo of Moscow, which is the last major independent radio station. And because it's so important, it sort of took on itself a lot of TV functions. People listen to Radio of Moscow, the people who don't watch TV anymore. And my program has one of the 2 highest ratings on this station. But I combine this, as I've said, with writing books, and right now with writing very popular books about the origins of Christianity. Highly critical, I would say.
And Julia, you mentioned there, recently you've had some problems and you're living in exile. As I understand it, there have been 2 attempts on your life in the last couple of years. Would you mind just describing what happened and why you think that might have happened?
I don't know. I wouldn't term this as attempts on my life. Actually, I think there was an attempt on my life. At least some very major problems. But this was back in year 2008. Soon after Russian-Georgian war. After this war, I was highly critical of Russian actions. I was always saying that it's Russia who started the war, and that Russia was purely and 100% aggressor, as we can see now in Ukraine and in different places. And I was highly critical as well of the actions of the South Ossetian president. He was a Russian puppet, but he was a thug, and his name was Kakhoyte, which is not important. It was after this that somewhere around 4 o'clock in the morning, on the road to my house, which is totally desolated and situated in the woods, I've seen some people following me. I was stupid enough to stop. And I saw some people following me on a totally deserted road on 4 o'clock in the morning. I stopped, asked them to stop following me because I was stupid enough to think that these are some Kremlin goons. Instead, I realized these people are probably from the Caucasus. I was pretty stiff scared, and I took a photo of them, actually of their car. It had no number plates. And the editor-in-chief of his name is Venediktov. He came and complained, actually very funny, he complained to the head of FSB at this time, to Mr. Bortnikov, precisely because I was very famous, and precisely because these people obviously were not FSB. I think they were goons hired by Mr. Kakoite, or something like this. And actually the funny thing that FSB realized that probably it would make for a very bad publicity. And maybe they were thinking that it's totally outrageous if some guy from the outside kills a famous Russian journalist. Maybe they thought that if a famous Russian journalist is killed, it should be a job of FSB and not some guy from outside. So actually they gave me some protection. And they found these guys. They didn't charge them, of course, with an attempt on my life because nothing could be proved, but it seems that they were pretty scary thugs by themselves. They were robberies, things like this. So why I'm telling you this is, strangely enough, that if there was any attempt on my life, it was back 10 years ago, and it was actually, I think, FSB who saved my life, strange enough, at that time. So this is actually the difference between what's happening right now in Russia and between what was happening then and between what's happening now. Because right now this sort of violence is permitted in Russia, and nobody is protected. And of course, it's not done directly by the state, but it is done by the people who are welcome to do the dirty job of the state. And of course, the most important of these people, the most well-known, is Mr. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the famous Kremlin cook, the one who is accused of meddling in US elections. And I had several attempts not on my life, definitely not on my life. The first was quite just unpleasant. They took, there was a bucket of poo and they dropped it on me. It was a special operation, but it was actually not very scary because obviously you don't want to kill somebody if you cover him with shit. The second thing was worse because they attacked a year after this. Actually what happened later is that I was not staying for long in Moscow after this story. I was sort of commuting, and I gave my car to my friend, and the brakes of the car, they just stopped working. It was not a big crash because actually it was almost nothing because the friend was very careful. But still it was a very strange story. I don't know why the brakes did not work.
Do you believe that there was that was sabotage in some?
Yes. Actually, I do believe it. Maybe it was not an intent to kill as well, because if something happens with the brakes, it's not necessarily a fatal crash. But still, it's something that could not be proved or disproved. And when the brakes did not, and when the brakes that did not work. There was another story which was pretty unpleasant because besides attacking me, they attacked all our house, which is a detached house, and there are two families living in the house. My parents, and I was staying with my parents at this time, so they are quite old. They are around 80. There was a family living in adjacent half of the house. There were two young children, two elders. And we were attacked with some sort of gas. Initially, I was thinking that it's not really very dangerous because obviously it was just smelly and incredibly unpleasant. That's sort of the gas that you use for dispersing demonstrations. So initially, I thought that this was not dangerous, but after Novaya Gazeta analyzed the gas, the substance, we realized that it's made of pretty unpleasant components, which are pretty dangerous to health. And actually, it's not the stuff that you use, for repelling gangsters or things like this. It's a really military-grade stuff. It's non-lethal chemical weapon. So it was pretty serious stuff, more serious than we realized at this time. But the major component was just an unpleasant smell. And probably because we analyzed the stuff and the majority of the stuff was on our car, probably they were listening to our telephone calls, and when they realized that we are analyzing the stuff, they torched the car, probably to make the stuff disappear totally. This was also a very unpleasant story because I was not at home at this time. My dad was at home. He's 80 years old. He ran out. He tried to extinguish the fire. It was pretty scary because the car could have exploded. I don't mind the car. I don't have the use for the car. Actually, it was dead because with this smell, it was impossible to ride in the car. But the fact that they torched the car with total disregard for my parents' life. This was certainly very unpleasant because it was not the car that was sitting somewhere in the street. This was the car that was sitting adjacent to a wooden house, and it was either the house burning or the possibility of an explosion of the car. That was pretty scary.
Now, Julia, there's two questions that obviously come from that, which is, first of all, you've said that you've got military-grade chemical weapons being used against you and your family. Who do you believe was behind that? Who do you believe was using those chemical weapons on you, and why?
Well, we in Novaya Gazeta, we believe that the most likely culprit in all these attacks is Mr. Yevgeny Prigozhin. We don't have any proofs, so we cannot substantiate this. But this is very similar to the sort of attacks Novaya Gazeta has been describing, to the sort of attacks on other people who we have reason to believe were victims to active measures taken by people around Mr. Prigozhin.
And why would they take such active measures against you? What have you been saying that would make someone decide that taking such measures was the right course of action?
That's an interesting part because, what we know in Novaya Gazeta, that apparently the structures of Mr. Prigozhin were very keen to distinguish themselves in the eyes of President Putin, in the eyes of Kremlin. And obviously that's not so much what I was saying, despite the fact that I was saying many bad things from the point of view of Kremlin. It's more of the fact that I was famous and well known, because actually the first victim of attentions of Mr. Prigozhin was Novaya Gazeta itself. There were spies in Novaya Gazeta who were sent by the structures close to the guy. For some reason, he has taken an incredible interest in everything that is related to Novaya Gazeta. And for instance, the first ever operation we have reason to believe was carried out by Mr. Prigozhin was very funny. It was pretty innocent. It was another guy who is very famous. His name is Dmitry Bykov. He's a famous Russian poet. He writes also a lot. He is also an author of Novaya Gazeta. So he was invited to take a part in some performance back in the Urals. I think it was 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, something like this. And then suddenly, so it was a scam, and after he made an appearance, after he went to the meeting, it was published that this was a meeting that was paid by some pro-government people, and he had to support the government party, and this was total bullshit. I mean, it was just made up. And right now we investigated this thing. We know how it happened. We know the people involved, and these were the people connected to Mr. Prigozhin. For some reason, Mr. Prigozhin was thinking that this sort of scam will compromise Mr. Bykov, which was pretty absurd and was not actually very well done, but this was the reason I'm telling you this is that it has nothing to do with the things that Mr. Bykov was writing, say, against Mr. Prigozhin, who was not known at this time, or something like this. It was just the desire to prove himself in the eyes of Kremlin, probably. We know for sure that they said there were some spies sent to Novaya Gazeta. They were collecting dossiers on different journalists, including me. And from what we heard when we discovered these spies, from what I know is that the editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta went directly to Kremlin and said, look, we have reason to believe that probably there will be an operation against these journalists. They will be either maimed or maybe killed or something. Did you order this? And Kremlin at this time, it was several years ago, stopped this story. So I have reasons to believe that this is a sort of initiative that comes not from the Kremlin, but Kremlin was stopping this sort of initiative. Now he's actively encouraging it.
Okay. Now that's a very big accusation, a very big statement to say that the Russian state or the Kremlin is actively encouraging either that kind of level of violence or if it, biological and chemical activities because of journalistic activity, because the perception, the influence industry. Now, can you talk to me about that? Obviously, this is a very big topic at the moment in the West. We've seen the Mueller inquiry. We've seen the accusations in relation to the 2016 election in America. To what degree that you can substantiate do you believe that the Kremlin is actively intending to either manipulate the press of perceptions or use violence in that way as well? I mean, obviously we've had the Skripals here as an example. Talk to me about that. Where do you believe that the Kremlin is at the moment in its activities?
When it comes to violence and people like Skripals, obviously it's just government activity. It's not Kremlin assigning, it to some do-gooders or evil-gooders. It's obviously GRU, and we have reasons to believe that Skripals were not an exception. That actually there were several people killed before this, including Mr. Perepelichny, who was poisoned. And obviously there were some things that, not so many victims as sensational press claims, not dozens of them. But obviously there were several people killed before Skripals, and Great Britain just didn't take notice. So that's how I explain this Skripal thing. So it's two completely different stories. Skripal is not about influencing Western opinion. Skripal, in the world that Kremlin lives, is about eliminating traitors and about giving warning to people who want to desert to the West. Because I think Mr. Putin right now finds himself in a difficult situation. Russian elite, it has been stealing a lot of money. And this money obviously isn't safe in Russia, and it has to be stored abroad. And what with the current Kremlin's activities, abroad has also become a place that is not safe. And Skripals and the like, this was just a warning. If you will talk to Western authorities, being members of Russian elite, being members of Russian security forces, being members of Putin's inner circle. There are a lot of these people in the West. You'd better watch yourself. You don't want to follow Skripal. So this is a totally separate thing. This is not about the West. So
that's your clear position on the Skripals. So then, if it's a separate, do you mind just describing to me then where you think the activities of influence operations, perception management. Where is that at the moment in terms of the Kremlin's position? If we look at the Mueller inquiry, if we look at activities, let's say, in perception management in relation to Syria or in relation to Venezuela, it seems, it could be alleged, that there's a great deal of activity out of Russia at the moment. Is that?
Oh,
is that
yes,
fair and
obviously.
accurate?
Yes, of course. Actually,
Okay.
that's the biggest. Mr. Putin is somebody who is very unlucky with what he's doing with the Russian economy. Russian economy is going down the gutter. In this situation, Mr. Putin wants the world to take notice of him somehow. So there are separate things that are probably stemming from the same root. But they're totally different. Skripal, it's a warning inside Russia. And actually, I don't believe that it was intended to be very public. I don't think that they intended to poison the daughter. I don't think they knew the daughter was here. It's just that they are not only vicious, but also not very professional. And suppose Skripal dropped dead, there was no daughter, I don't think anybody would have investigated. I think he was 65? It would have been attributed either to the natural causes of death, or, they could have been suspicious and a lot of talk, but nobody would have bothered to check. So what I think has happened is there were several murders of this kind. Then Skripal's murder went wrong because his daughter was with him, and it was found out. And so it was exactly like the Litvinenko case. Mr. Putin did not want the polonium to be found in the case of Litvinenko. He just wanted to people like Litvinenko be totally stiff scared of the possibility of running to the West. He wanted to make an impression, and he wanted to make an impression in such a way that nothing could have been proved. And he just forgot because, when they used this polonium thing, there was a lot of Russian scientific research, Soviet scientific research, how to use polonium in such cases. And all this research dated back to the 70s. And all this research said that polonium is untraceable. So they looked at the articles, scientific articles back in the 70s. They thought they were clever. And they didn't realize that instead of being clever, they are actually, leaving traces all over the places they've been doing this stuff.
Now, Julie, you've made some sort of assertions, and your opinion of that, therefore, is that they were either incompetent insofar as they were killing people without, or poisoning people without intending to, and that they were incompetent by leaving traces, and they were incompetent by trying to essentially commit an assassination and then blundering it. There's a lot of assertions you're making there. What substantiation do you have?
The only thing that I can make not as an assertion is that they tried to kill Skripals. I'm trying to explain to myself what happened, as I've said, one of the obvious points is that it was not just a cruel operation, it was just also a blunder on the part of the people who performed the operation. And the only way I can substantiate this is to point out that they were blundering, we know right now that these two people who poisoned Skripals, Bashirov and Chipiga, they were not very professional. They behaved themselves very stupidly. We also know that, for instance, that when let me try to phrase it and try to remember what was happening, because all this is a little bit of old stuff. But still we know that after these two people were named, Russian journalists started researching. And we found out that their passports were issued in a row. They had actually almost the same numbers. There was difference, I think, in 5 numbers. And the journalists looked at the list, looked at the other numbers of the passports that were issued at the same time. And they discovered a list of almost 100 names that were all fake names, and that were probably all GRU operatives. And this list was submitted as a list probably to save the time, which was very stupid because this is the major blunder. The journalists then discovered that some of these people have the cars, and when you register a car in Russia, you have to give the address. And all these people gave us their home address, actually the address of their military base. And people looked at the other database, which lists the people who gave their very place as the address where their cars are registered. And it was some 500 names, all GRU agents. And it was incredible, just like, these people, another couple of GRU agents who went to Brussels, I think, and they were arrested there, and they had in their pockets a receipt of a taxi receipt. They were driving from GRU headquarters to the airport, and they kept the taxi receipt. So this all does not instill confidence in the professionalism of Russian GRU. So all this leads me to believe that the people who are not operating at the height of their professional capabilities could also commit the blunder of trying to poison Skripal, not realizing that his daughter is also with him.
Okay. Right, so we've covered off the Skripals. Let's park that conversation. Obviously, these podcasts are specifically about information operations in their broadest sense, and the transparency and trying to work out what's actually going on in the world and who's doing it and why they're doing it and how they're doing it. What is your position? I mean, you're obviously living now in exile. You've said things about the state and the other countries that have put you in some danger. What is your position in terms of the Russian involvement in the 2016 presidential race in America? With your knowledge as a journalist, an investigative journalist, what is your position on that? Maybe
before we switch to this question, which is obviously the most important for you, and probably you won't like my answers, we'll switch to another story, which is the involvement of Russian disinformation operations abroad prior to this, which were mostly concerned actually with Ukraine and with Georgia, because I think it's very important.
Okay.
Because I think this was a piece that the West missed on completely, and actually, for instance, we can see that some of Putin's disinformation campaigns were pretty successful initially, at least partly successful. Because let us look what happened back in year 2008. Russia attacked Georgia. It was absolutely the same thing that we did in Ukraine. We claim that there are volunteers, quote, volunteers, who are fighting the wicked Georgian Nazis. We were using some separatist state that really didn't exist, that was totally financed by Russia and whose existence depended on Russia. And we were saying that no, this is a separatist movement, they are against Georgians. And actually we managed to convince at least some of the world, at least part of the people, that Georgians have done something wrong. Despite the fact that the situation with Georgia was exactly the same as the situation with Ukraine 6 years after this. Actually, this whole time, when it came to Georgia, what Russian propaganda was claiming, that this is the United States who are making war on Russia by Georgian hands, which is a complete reversal of what was happening. So what happened is that the West pretended not to notice what happened in Georgia. Actually, there was a whitewashing report of European Commission that was very strange. The report was written by Mrs. Heidi Talyavini, and the report literally stated that, there was a war between Russia and Georgia, and Russians are claiming the Georgians have started the war, and Georgians are claiming that Russians have started the war, and we don't know where truth is. That doesn't sound a bit like a lot of report to me. We know that President Barack Obama, after the war, has announced this famous перезагрузка, the rebooting of relations with Russia, as if the relations were soured because of some actions the United States has taken. And what I'm saying that this is very important because this has emboldened Mr. Putin, and he started thinking that he can get away with anything. If there were no перезагрузка with Mr. Barack Obama, I don't think there would have been any Crimea annexation. Because what was happening in Ukraine was exactly 100% like what was happening in Georgia. So what I'm saying that a lot of Western tolerance and Western meekness has encouraged Mr. Putin, and we came back to year 2014, that is annexation of Crimea and Ukraine. And we go back to year 2016, which is intervention into United States election. Here I can be very frank with you. I don't think that there was, I don't think Putin influenced the elections, but not for want of trying. I mean, he did try to influence. Obviously, Russian hackers hacked the DNC server. Obviously, there was a lot of Russian troll activities on Facebook. But all Russian operations of this kind are mostly designed to steal money from state. So the majority of these operations were, to say that we've spent $1 million and can you please us pay back? So I don't think the scope of these operations was enough to influence the elections. What I think the scope of these operations, and especially the DNC hack, was enough for, to instill a deep distrust of the American political system and to give the Democrats an instrument to destabilize the situation. And I'm afraid, and probably I don't think you will like what I say, but I think the biggest, if there was any real goal of Mr. Putin in meddling in United States elections, it was precisely creating distrust of the system and ruining the smooth functioning of the democratic process. And if this was the case, then the people who helped him to reach the goal was not Mr. Trump, but actually the Democrats and actually Mr. James Comey. I'm sorry to say this.
And would you just explain your thinking on that in a little bit more detail? You're saying that the Democrats may have actually been, either wittingly or unwittingly, the facilitators of the narrative that Russia was trying to project. Just go through that again. I mean, we can obviously see that there was hacking of the Democratic congressional campaign. We can see there's hacking of the Democratic National Committee. There were 13 Russian individuals who are indicted. There was 3 private sector companies that were identified within Mueller's report. Are you suggesting, therefore, that the plan was always from Russia to enable the Democrats to run with that and to almost provide them with a story by actually, attacking them and then enabling them to therefore say it was Trump and infer collusion? What exactly is the point you're making?
I actually am not making the point because it's very hard to ascribe for me to Putin really demonic qualities. I don't think I'm not sure the things that Russia is doing are usually done with such a great foresight. We've just been talking about Russian GRU agents who are bungling their job and doing things that, pretty stupid. To think about this as some, mastermind plan of Mr. Putin, I think will be ascribing him almost Luciferic qualities. My initial impression was that Mr. Putin was just reacting. He's living in his own world, and in his own world, he's constantly harassed by United States. It's not the unique feature of Mr. Putin. There are a lot of countries in the world like Sudan, Bolivia, Venezuela, to name, that believe that United States is always doing something to frustrate them, whereas the United States usually is not very much aware of their existence, especially the ordinary citizens of the United States. So with Mr. Putin, it was really the United States that was standing behind the Georgians, not because it was the United States that attacked Russia through Georgians, but because if there was no support of the United States, the Georgians would not be bold enough to resist Russia. To Putin, it was Maidan. To Putin, Maidan in Ukraine, he really believes that Maidan in Ukraine was done by United States. It's like believing in a devil, in his mind, Crimea or Donbass was just a retaliation of what United States did. And in his mind, he really believes that United States are meddling in Russian elections, that all Russian opposition is financed by United States, and all this shit he really believes. So I think that when he was meddling in the US elections, it was just for him a sort of retaliation. He was not thinking about any big plans. But if he was thinking about really big plans, and, to be frank, I don't think anything that was published from DNC servers could have influenced the outcome of elections because, just name me anything that you've read in the service that in these emails that was really important, that influenced you somehow.
So your point of view then on this is that the intent was there to meddle to some extent. However, from your perception, the GRU attempt was not sophisticated and was sort of blundered. However, it did achieve its strategic aim, which was to sow the seeds of doubt in the democratic process in America. So to some extent, surely your argument falls down there, because if they have managed to sow seeds of doubt in the whole belief in the democratic process of America, there's an argument to say it was actually a very successful campaign, wasn't it?
Yes, actually, I know I am saying completely two contradictory things, which is not actually very strange because, life is contradictory. So what I'm saying is that probably initially I would say, there was the minimum goal and the maximum goal. And the minimum goal was just, to vent his displeasure, which would not have achieved anything if it were not for Democrats who took this and raised it as banner. And by doing this, they damaged the American political system more severely than Putin could ever have done. And that's the main damage. And I'm sorry to say that they have become unwitting accomplices to Mr. Putin. And by their hands, Mr. Putin managed to achieve the things he probably never have dreamed of achieving. And of course, that succeeded beyond his wildest expectations.
Now, if that is the case, and your reading of the situation is accurate, which I can't suggest knowing one way or the other, what would seem to make sense, therefore, is that if the Kremlin has recognized, intentionally or unintentionally, they've achieved a great victory in strategic terms by what they've done, you would therefore imagine that their desire to use these techniques in the future would grow.
Absolutely.
You said that Russian Empire collapsed in 2014 and lost the possibility of soft power, as a quote of yours from that you've said before. Do you therefore assess, from your position of knowing a great deal of a number of these people and having worked in this area for a long time, do you assess therefore that the West or the world should be concerned about Russia's ongoing use of strategic communications as a weapon system?
Absolutely, yes, but I would also warn, because the world should be concerned of both. On the one hand, it should be concerned of Russian activities when it comes to hacking, when it comes to buying politicians, especially on the far right, and when it comes to meddling in the affairs of the countries that are vulnerable to this sort of operations, and I think the majority of these countries are situated in the Eastern Europe. But I would also be very careful, because if you overdo this, for instance, on the part of Great Britain, I saw some, attempts at portraying Brexit as something that was done by Mr. Putin, which is, purely bullshit. And it is disgraceful. And fortunately, it did not reach the same proportions in the United States. But as I've said, there's perhaps one very important thing to say about Mr. Putin. He's not good at building things. But he's good at ruining things. He's really good at ruining things, for instance, in Georgia, when he managed to ruin the government of Mr. Saakashvili, who was one of the best presidents that not simply Georgia, but this part of the world ever had. Mr. Putin has managed to ruin Ukrainian political life pretty much, because obviously Ukraine now is in a very vulnerable state. It has major territorial problems. Not that Mr. Putin has gained himself anything out of this, but he just wrecked the neighbor. So what I'm saying that Mr. Putin is really very good at wrecking, and he's really very good at seeing and exploiting the vulnerabilities. So since he have very small resources, really, the best defense against Mr. Putin is not to have these sort of vulnerabilities. Why he did, beyond all expectations, succeed in America, for me, is precisely because there was this big vulnerability in American society. There was this big distrust of Democrats towards Trump. They hated him. They thought not simply of Democrats, also of state machinery. They thought that he's unfit to rule, and they did everything in their power to ruin him. And by doing this, they contributed unwittingly to Mr. Putin's success. So there are two different things to do. First, to be very careful when Mr. Putin really starts financing, or when he does some just, operations like with Skripal, which is totally, absolutely, outrageous. But also not to overestimate his ability to influence elections, to influence political figures, major political figures, and not to discredit your political system, trying to ascribe to your enemies some sort of being in cahoots with Mr. Putin.
Do you believe that the techniques of information operations in Russia or out of Russia exist only at state level, or also now within the private sector as well?
As I was saying, there's a double-tier system, because some of this is totally at state level. Obviously, Skripal is a state level. Obviously, the DNC hack is a state level. But what Putin is good at, he's good at denying responsibility, And this is why he's farming it out to several operators. For instance, Facebook operation was not run by the state. It was run by people associated with Mr. Prigozhin. Precisely because this permits to deny responsibility. And this is absolutely the same thing that was happening, if you can see, in Ukraine. Because anytime you try to say that there is Russian aggression in Ukraine, Kremlin can counter this by saying, look guys, these are all volunteers. I don't have any influence over them. This is the real stuff. And so, as I've said, this is precisely why Mr. Putin is farming out this sort of operation to outsiders, to private contractors. So to claim that they are outsiders, which is obviously bullshit, because if you look closer at these sort of operations, well, these people have all the support of Russian state, and how do you say? Russian state is a state which nationalizes gas and oil, which is trying to control all information sphere. It's obvious that Russian state would not farm out any monopoly over violence, because the monopoly over violence is the first thing that actually characterizes the state. If you don't have monopoly over violence, you're not a state.
And do you, as a journalist, know the names and identities of the private sector companies? Is it a sort of known secret? Who are the companies that this work is being farmed out to, and who are the individuals? Or is this known in Russia?
Look, it's not only me. These are the people that were indicted by Mr. Mueller. He indicted Mr. Prigozhin himself. He indicted several of his associates. And as I said, the Facebook operation was obviously the one that was farmed out to Prigozhin structures. The same thing we can see happening in Africa, and actually partly in Syria, because the people who are also officially connected or unofficially, but it's widely known, connected to Mr. Prigozhin, are carrying out military operations in Africa. And as I said, they're posing a sort of private military company. That's the company called Wagner. And obviously it's bullshit, as I've said. The country that tries to monopolize everything obviously will not farm out to private individuals military operations. This goes against the grain. But this gives Mr. Putin a possibility of denial in case something goes wrong.
Okay, so if I try and sort of start drawing this to a close, if I'm understanding you right, Julia, your position on this, as someone who has a great deal of sort of inside knowledge inside Russia, is that yes, GRU agents have been using influence operations, but rather
No. GRU agents were hacking the DNC server. The Facebook operation was the Prigozhin operation. From what I can, this I gathered from reading Mueller's report.
Yes. Okay. And so, but your perception more generally then in Russia is, yes, there is a systematic industry or an information industry that is being run by private sector proxies, but with state involvement, but essentially using cutouts, private sector cutouts, to now conduct the work. And that work is still being carried out in Africa, in Georgia. Which other countries do you think this is happening? You mentioned Africa. Where else do you believe that is happening? The proxies.
Well, we can see Venezuela. We can see Venezuela right now. There are right now armed people, and these are armed people not only from Russian military forces, but also we can hear mentioned Mr. Wagner's company, Syria. If you do remember what happened under Deir ez-Zor, it was precisely the same. It was very actually it was what happened under Deir ez-Zor. If you remember, there were about 200 Russians killed. It was very typical kind of military operation for the Kremlin. Mainly there were lines. There was the American territory, which was controlled by Americans and Kurds, and there was oil in this territory. There was Syrian territory controlled by Syrians and Russians, and the Wagner Group tried to take the oil from the Kurds and from Americans, all the while saying we are not here. So I guess that, I'm sorry for the jibe, but maybe under Obama they would have succeeded, because the American commanders simply would not have permission to use the weapons. Now what happened under Trump is that the Americans said, oh, you're saying there are no Russians there? Very well, we destroy everything that there is. So they destroyed these people. There were 200 Russians, and Russia actually said nothing, which was very funny because, Russian government is always blaming Americans for meddling in Ukraine, in Russia, you name it, where the Americans are not meddling. But the moment they had a real military confrontation in which 200 Russians were destroyed, and they were destroyed. This was the first direct military confrontation between United States and Russia. I don't know since when. So instead of screeching loudly, the state propaganda machine just stopped in its tracks and said there was nothing there. There were no Russians there. It was very funny, and this actually is another very important point to make. And this is a very important point, that Mr. Putin is constantly harassing the West and constantly saying that he's ready to go to war. And either Deir ez-Zor and under other in other places, we see that on the contrary, he's not ready to go to war. He wages hybrid war because he can wage no other war, because he knows very well that in any real war he will be just broken to pieces. So the fact that he's waging hybrid war, it's not a side of his. It's not because he's strong, but because he's weak. Because he knows very well that there was a good Russian phrase about the short victorious war that was coined back in 1905. And it was coined by a Russian minister who wanted Russia to go to war with Japan, and he was thinking that Russia will triumph. As we know from history, it was Japan that triumphed. The war was neither short nor victorious, and the end was the revolution. So Mr. Putin knows very well that because Russian state is in a total shambles, it's weak. Everybody is stealing everything, including in the army, and actually first of all in the army. There's no way in a real military confrontation Russia will survive and Russia will triumph. So what he says, he instead paints the picture. He instead paints the war that is televised. He instead dabbles in hybrid war. So anytime Mr. Putin opens his mouth and says, I am going, we have new weapons that are fantastic weapons and things like this. So this is all a scam. Don't believe this. Under Deir ez-Zor, we've seen that whenever there's a direct military confrontation, Putin backs off.
And what would you say, therefore, if non-kinetic is the future, because the risk of kinetic would be loss, that would again identify a growing need to use information operations as a sort of force multiplier, as a means to have greater effect with minimal spend or with minimal effort. What should the listeners of this podcast be looking out for to identify emerging Russian hybrid methods and techniques around the world? What are the indicators? What does it look like? What does it sound like? Who's involved?
I think you should look for signs. When, for instance, you are seeing somebody who is saying that there were Nazis in Ukraine during Maidan, For instance, if you're looking at somebody who is saying that, Russian intervention in Donbass and in Lugansk saved their citizens from being annihilated by Ukrainian Nazis, if you are looking at somebody who is dubious about what happened to MH17, then I think you have great reason to suppose that people like these are stooges for Russian propaganda. If you see anybody that is, sort of does not know what happened to Skripals and is having second thoughts, I would look very carefully at this guy. But I would probably also conclude with this fact, that, don't overestimate Mr. Putin. There was a fabulous machine of Soviet propaganda that was really big in 1930s. It was Soviet propaganda not just inside, but also abroad. It was functioning through people whose role is not recognized by history, because I'm not sure whether you have ever heard of a man called Willy Münzenberg. You probably heard of the man whose name was Goebbels, who was the Nazi famous propaganda chief. But Mr. Goebbels was just a bleak reflection of his red counterpart. His name was Willy Münzenberg. He was Lenin's and then Stalin's and Comintern's propaganda chief, who was disseminating left views all over Europe, who was paying with Soviet money incredible operations, who was held in anti-colonial congresses, who was making left ideas fashionable all over Europe among intellectuals in universities. This was the man who was the main architect of the Save Saka and Vanzetti campaign in Europe and things like this. This was the man who was standing because the ridiculous story about Hitler burning his own Reichstag. Hitler is dead, Willy is dead, and the story lives on. So what I'm saying that Russia propaganda achieved Soviet propaganda achieved enormous successes back in 1930. For instance, you had major European figures like Mr. Feuchtwanger, who were approving of Moscow processes and who were writing that this is probably the truth. You were having major figures that were saying that to doubt the Soviet Union is to doubt the future, is to doubt the progress. We don't have anything like this right now when it comes to Mr. Putin. Because if you compare the people who were pro-Stalin back in the 30s, and as I said, they were major European intellectuals, and you compare the sort of scum who is right now writing making noises about, Ukrainian Nazis who made the Maidan, there's nothing to compare.
And who is the puppet master then? Who is the head of the Stratcoms, do you believe, for Putin? Is it a name we know, or is it someone who's in the shadows?
Oh, no. There's no puppet master in this case. I don't think, we can name some puppet masters. Okay, the usual mastermind, the usual guy who is associated with this sort of propaganda, his name is Vladislav Surkov. He is the former Putin's propaganda chief, and he's the guy who actually instilled a lot of dread in Mr. Putin back in the beginning of his presidency. It was Mr. Surkov who was generally responsible for this idea of oranges revolutions masterminded by United States. That are a real threat to Mr. Putin. But I would not overestimate Mr. Surkov's role in this, because I think the guy who is really the mastermind in this case is Mr. Putin himself. He lives in this world. He listens only to the people who say to him what he likes to hear. And this spreads farther and farther. I don't think we can pinpoint people like Surkov or Prigozhin or people in FSB like current chief of FSB, Mr. Bortnikov, of supplying people with this sort of propaganda ploys. because that's what Putin believes himself.
And if I was to say to you, therefore, then the Internet Research Agency is one of the companies that's been mentioned in the Mueller report.
Yeah, but that's Prigozhin. That's Prigozhin.
Now, who do they answer into then? Who does the IRA?
No. The Internet Research Agency is Prigozhin. We have talked about this many times.
Yeah.
There's sort of almost no doubt about this, because we can very well see how they are connected, and the connection is made in Mueller report. So we can say Prigozhin, we can say Internet Research Agency, but it's just the same thing.
Okay.
But just, as I said, don't overestimate the role of Mr. Prigozhin, despite the fact that he's very important and he's probably one of the people who is volunteering to do this. Don't think that he's, somebody... I would say that currently probably Mr. Prigozhin is more influential than Mr. Surkov, because Mr. Surkov is a little bit of pastime. There's probably one thing to conclude. Mr. Putin likes monopolies. So when he gives oil, say, to a guy who's named Sechin. And Sechin controls the oil. When he gives out the media, he gives the media to people named Kovalchuks, and Kovalchuks control the media, at least the majority of the media. And we can see that foreign operations right now, both military and influential operations, are farmed out to Mr. Prigozhin, and this is a state of fact. It is Mr. Prigozhin who is responsible for a lot of things that are happening in Africa, and probably he was the one who volunteered for this, but obviously he has all the credentials. He's a cutout.
And the motive in this case, let's say that we follow that train of thought through, the motive therefore is to achieve Russian influence in Africa or to undermine other influence in Africa? Which one is it? Is it a projection of force, or, like you said before, an intervention just to muddle other people's efforts? Which way would you go with that?
I would say that Mr. Putin thinks himself right now an outcast, and he's really an outcast. So I would mainly attribute this to psychological factors. He needs some retinue. He needs something to inspire in him a thought that he is a successful political leader. If he cannot hobnob with the American president and with German chancellor, then he can, have these people like Maduro or Amar al-Bashir and many other people who are, who will be glad to come and get some Russian money in exchange for empty promises. And speaking of intervention in elections, there's a very important lesson and a very important story to learn. Recently, Kremlin, actually the Internet Research Agency, actually the agents of Mr. Prigozhin's, has intervened into elections in Madagascar, of all things. That's obviously not a major country, Madagascar, not as important as United States. So they managed to lose this election. They managed to lose this election at some incredible rate. The candidate gets something I don't remember, 1%, 7%, something like this. So the lessons to be learned from this is that if Russia cannot win the elections in Madagascar, it probably really cannot win the elections in the United States.
Okay, so you presented a rather bleak picture of incompetence, really, in terms of the attempts of the Russian state to manipulate. I'm going to draw it to a close. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that you feel it should be discussed as part of this topic in terms of the nature of modern Russian influence operations? Is there anything that I've missed out in terms of the question?
I think we've covered really pretty everything, and I would like to stress this fact that incompetence does not mean that there's it's incompetence on the one hand and it's gruesomeness on another, because Skripals are poisoned, Ukraine is in shambles, Georgia is in shambles. So sometimes it's stupid, but sometimes it works. And the other point is probably, as I say, do not let Mr. Putin explode the weaknesses, the weakness of the system. Because what happened in America, it was not so much a strength of Mr. Putin as a fact that Putin's interference was used as a tool to do away with Mr. Trump, and I think it was both unfair to President Trump, and whatever his personal vicissitudes are. The damage that was done to the American system by the people who were using this as a pretext was much greater than Trump could have ever done.
Well, that's a fascinating way to end it. Thank you so much, Julia, for your time. I really appreciate it.
I'm sorry if
editing this and getting it out there.
I'm sorry if I sounded, on American elections, very, very political and correct.
No, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's a really kind of a clear perspective and an important one. So thank you very much for sharing it, and I think it'll start the conversation. It'll get people talking in different ways about the same topic, which I think is a very valid thing to do at the moment. So, Julia, thank you so much. I'm going to cut this today and upload it probably this evening, and I thank you for your time. Best
thank
of
you.
luck with your future.
Thank you. Actually, I think we have the recording. We can also send it to you, and maybe we'll also be using it myself.
Great.
I think that my English is a little bit rusty.
No, it's very good.
I have been learning nothing but Hebrew for the last couple of months. So.
Okay, well, you have a fantastic grasp of English. You don't need to worry about that. But yes, please do send it across, the recording, because it may be a better quality than I've got, and then we can, and I'll cut that and send it out tonight. Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Well, thank you so much, Julie.
Bye.
I do have his email address.